The needles catch the lamplight first. 6 of them, thin as pine needles, sit along the inside of a man's forearm, placed there by hands so steady they don't even tremble. The man on the bed has soaked through his sheets. His breathing sounds ragged, and his skin has turned the color of old candle wax. Outside the window, a dozen faces press against the glass, including ranchers, shopkeepers, and a woman holding a baby she keeps turning away from the scene inside. Nobody moves and nobody knocks. They just watch the Japanese woman work while they try to decide if what they're seeing is medicine or something they don't have a word for yet. Her name is Yuki Tanaka. The man on the bed is Dr. Emmett Calloway, who happens to be the only doctor within a 2-day ride, and he's been dying since the sun came up. Western medicine had 4 full days to break this fever, but it failed. Now there's a woman in his room who learned her healing from a system older than the United States itself, and the town outside that window has one question they can't shake. Can she actually do what the doctor couldn't? She arrived in Dust Creek on a Tuesday in the spring of 1887, stepping off the stage with 2 leather bags and a wooden chest the size of a small trunk. Thomas Hale was waiting at the post with his hat in his hands, looking the way men do when they've made a decision they're only half sure about. He'd written to a matchmaking service in San Francisco that connected him with a family in Osaka, and now here she was. Yuki Tanaka was 24 years old, spoke careful English she'd spent 2 years practicing, and watched the town watch her. They stared at her face for about 3 seconds, but then their eyes moved to the chest. It went with her everywhere. Thomas carried it inside the house that first afternoon and set it on the kitchen table, where she opened it before she even unpacked her clothes. Inside were rows of paper-wrapped bundles, small ceramic jars with wax-sealed lids, a cloth roll of slender instruments, and 2 worn books with Japanese characters pressed into the covers. The smell that came out when the lid lifted was a mix of dried bark, something sharp and green, and something almost sweet. It drifted through the front window and reached the neighbor's porch before supper was even served. Thomas's neighbor asked him about the scent the following week, and he simply said she liked to cook with herbs. It wasn't a lie, exactly. What Yuki practiced was called Kampo, which wasn't some folk remedy or kitchen guesswork. Kampo is a formal system of medicine that Japan had been refining for over 1,000 years. And while it's built on the same foundational texts as traditional Chinese medicine, Japanese practitioners shaped it into something distinct. It has its own diagnostic logic, its own herb formulations, and its own understanding of how the body moves heat and fluid and energy through specific pathways. A trained Kampo practitioner spent years learning to read a patient's pulse the way a river pilot reads water depth, and Yuki had learned from her grandfather, who'd learned from his teacher, who'd learned from his. Thomas's hand got infected 3 weeks after she arrived, while the doctor was out of town. She applied a poultice of gardenia fruit and dried ginger root, wrapped it clean, and told him to keep it still. 4 days later, the infection was gone. He didn't tell anyone, but he didn't forget it either. Doctor. Emmett Calloway had delivered every single baby born in Dust Creek since 1879, and he was the man people turned to when life turned sideways. He had set a 12-year-old's shattered arm after a horse rolled on the boy, talked a grieving father down from a ledge behind the feed store, and once performed an emergency appendectomy on a kitchen table by lantern light while a thunderstorm shattered every window on the east side of the house. The patient survived that night, and as a result, the people in Dust Creek didn't just trust Calloway. They organized their entire sense of safety around his presence. He was Harvard trained, a fact he never felt the need to mention because everyone in town already knew it. He kept his office spotless, his instruments boiled, and his medical records in neat, disciplined columns. He read the latest medical journals whenever they finally reached him, which was sometimes 6 weeks late and sometimes 3 months. But his care was genuine and lacked any sense of performance. When Calloway told a patient they were going to be fine, they usually believed him because he had been right often enough to earn that kind of faith. He met Yuki for the first time at the Hale Ranch about 2 months after she arrived, stopping by to check on Thomas's shoulder after a fence post accident. She brought him coffee and asked one careful, quiet question about whether he thought the inflammation would track up toward the joint. He gave her a polite, brief answer before moving on, later telling Thomas that his wife seemed bright in the way men say bright when they actually mean harmless. He referred to her methods as kitchen cures, though he didn't say it with any real cruelty. He used the term the same way he'd talk about an old wives' remedy or a country poultice, meaning the kind of thing people did before real medicine finally arrived in the West. When a patient mentioned that Yuki had given them something for a stomach complaint, he would simply nod and say that ginger does settle the gut before changing the subject. He wasn't dismissing her out of malice, but he just couldn't fit what she did into any framework he'd been taught, so he put her work in the smallest box he had and left it there. Yuki never pushed back against his dismissal. She watched him work whenever the opportunity arose, observing him examine patients at the general store or overhearing his explanations through open windows, and she even read the one medical textbook Thomas kept on his shelf from cover to cover. She kept her own medicine chest stocked and stayed silent about what she was seeing. What she saw was a man running entirely on fumes. Calloway was sleeping 4 hours some nights and only 3 on others, and he skipped meals whenever cases ran long, which happened almost every day. His hands stayed steady because he forced them to, but Thomas noticed the hollows under the doctor's eyes deepening through the summer, and mentioned it once over a fence. Calloway just waved the concern off. He was the kind of man who believed his own body was just another problem he could outwork. A lot of men in the territories felt that way, and were right for a long time, until suddenly they weren't. The fever was going to test that assumption in ways no textbook had ever prepared him for. It started at the river camp 3 miles east of town, where a crew of laborers had been camped for 6 weeks, running a new irrigation line. The first man went down on a Monday with what looked like a bad chill, suffering from shaking and joint pain, and a fever that spiked by nightfall and refused to come down by morning. By Wednesday, 4 more men were flat on their backs, and by Friday, the sickness had followed the dusty road straight into the heart of town. Calloway recognized the symptoms immediately. He saw the high fever, the pain deep in the joints, and the confusion that set in fast and hit the patients hard. He had seen remittent fever before, the kind that follows bad water and always gets worse before it gets better. He recorded it in his ledger as bilious remittent fever in his careful handwriting and started the standard treatment, which meant quinine for the fever, bloodletting to reduce the heat, and cold compresses changed every 2 hours. It was the approach the journals demanded. The fever ignored every bit of it. The quinine didn't bring temperatures down the way it was supposed to, and the bloodletting only left the patients weaker without making them any cooler. The compresses helped for maybe 20 minutes before the heat climbed right back up, so Calloway pushed even harder with more quinine and stricter intervals and longer hours at every bedside. He told the town the fever would break in a day or two, once the treatments finally accumulated, and he truly believed that when he said it. The first death came on Tuesday. Roy Decker was 41 years old and part of the irrigation crew, and he was followed quickly by a woman from the south end of town named Ada Mills, who had bought something from a sick man at the general store. The third to go was a 12-year-old boy who had been swimming in the river the week before, and came home that evening complaining that his legs felt wrong. With 3 deaths in 4 days, the town stopped moving the way communities do when they are truly terrified. The main street grew quieter. Doors were held open a beat longer so people could look both ways before stepping out, and every conversation dropped to half its usual volume. Calloway hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since that first death. He wasn't eating, and he was running on something that looked like determination to the neighbors, but felt more like stubbornness holding hands with dread inside his own chest. He knew the medical framework he was working from, and he felt he just needed more time for the science to take hold. He didn't get any more time. On the 5th day of the outbreak, he collapsed in Ada Mill's empty room while he was stripping the sheets for the next patient. His assistant found him on the floor, soaked through his shirt, with skin that was burning to the touch. When they finally got a thermometer on him, it read 104 degrees and was still climbing. The only doctor in town was now the sickest man in it. The deputy, a young man named Cord Avery, rode for the nearest town before the sun went down that evening. It would be 2 days there and 2 days back, assuming the other doctor could even leave his own patients, which meant 4 days at the minimum and probably 5. Thomas Hale heard the news at the feed store and walked home as fast as his legs would carry him. He came through the front door already calling Yuki's name, not sure what he was going to say or what he was even hoping she would answer. Yuki was already sitting at the kitchen table with the mortar and pestle going. Her medicine chest stood wide open beside her, and the sharp smell of dried bark filled the room like she had been expecting this exact moment. She had been. She just hadn't said so until now. Yuki didn't look up when the door opened and Thomas stepped into the room. Her hand stayed busy as she pressed dried bupleurum root and skullcap into the stone mortar with measured strength, working the pestle in the same slow circles she had practiced since childhood. The medicine chest sat open to a very specific compartment, the one she reserved for what her tradition called heat excess conditions, which were the kind of fevers that burned a person from the inside out and only grew more violent if you tried to cool the skin without clearing the internal source. "You already knew," Thomas said, and the way he spoke made it clear he wasn't looking for a confirmation. "I suspected it 4 days ago," she replied, as she finally set the pestle down to look him in the eye. "I needed to be certain before I said anything that might cause a panic." What she had recognized in the rhythm of the fever wasn't something the medical journals in Calloway's office would have ever named. In the world of Kampo, the human body isn't just a machine that happens to be running hot, but rather a complex system of relationships where heat follows specific pathways once it builds up beyond what the organs can process. What she was seeing in the people of Dust Creek matched a sickness she had watched move through the crowded river districts of Osaka during a summer outbreak when she was only 19 years old. The signs were all there, from the joint pain that arrived just before the fever peaked to the waves of delirium that hit without warning, and especially that deep shade of red that stained the center of the tongue. Her grandfather had treated that long-ago outbreak with a formulation called Sho-saiko-to, which was a decoction built around bupleurum root, ginger, and licorice that was designed to give the body's heat a door to walk through instead of trying to suppress it by force. Calloway had spent the last week trying to push the fever down with cold water and quinine, but that was exactly where the danger lived. You cannot extinguish a fire like this by fighting it head-on, because the only way to save the patient is to open the vents and let the heat escape on its own terms. She explained all of this to Thomas in plain, quiet words while they stood in their kitchen with the lamp burning low against the shadows. She described the acupuncture points she would use alongside the herbal tea, focusing on the gallbladder and liver meridians that her grandfather had always described as the body's natural release valves. She even laid out the dietary changes Calloway would need to follow, insisting he avoid anything warming and stick to clear broths until his internal systems finally stabilized. Thomas stayed very still while he listened to her plan. He had trusted her hands since the 3rd week of their marriage when she saved his own infected palm. But he knew that this situation carried a much heavier weight. If Calloway died while under Yuki's care in a town that already watched her with suspicion, the risk would be far greater than a simple poultice on a ranch hand's skin. "If something goes wrong," he started to say, but she didn't let him finish the thought. "Something is already wrong," she said as she picked up the pestle to finish the grind. "He will die without this help, and while it might not happen tonight, the fever isn't breaking, and the medicine he's taking isn't touching the root of the problem." She paused for a second to let the weight of the moment settle between them. "Doing nothing is just as much of a choice as what I am proposing, and I want you to understand that I see it that way." He didn't offer a reply for a long moment, but then he reached down and picked up her heavy medicine chest before heading straight for the front door. The deputy's wife, Clara Avery, was sitting at the bedside when they arrived at the doctor's house, and the wet cloth she had placed across Calloway's forehead had already gone warm again. She stood up the moment Yuki walked in with the supplies and looked toward Thomas for some kind of explanation. He gave her a single, firm nod that seemed to settle the matter. Clara stepped back toward the wall, but she didn't leave the room. She stood by the window with her arms crossed tight, watching in silence as Yuki set down the chest, unrolled the white instrument cloth, and began the work. Word travels fast in a place like Dust Creek, where people have nothing to do but sit on their porches and worry about who might be the next to fall ill. Within an hour of Yuki starting her treatment, a small crowd had started to gather on the dirt street outside Calloway's house, though they weren't shouting or throwing stones yet. They just stood there in the dark with their hats held in their hands, looking for a place to put the fear that had been building up for weeks. There were only a dozen people at first, but that number quickly grew to 20 as the news spread from house to house. Sheriff Briggs eventually walked up and knocked on the door himself. He was a reasonable man compared to most lawmen in the territory, which meant he stayed polite and soft-spoken right up until the moment he decided to stop offering choices. Thomas was the one who answered the door, and Briggs kept his voice low and steady, using that specific tone he saved for when he was trying to talk someone out of making a mistake they couldn't take back. "Thomas, you need to get your wife out of this house right now," the sheriff said. "She's the only person in this entire town doing anything that might actually work," Thomas replied. "She's in there sticking needles into the only doctor we've got," Briggs said as he tried to look past Thomas into the dark hallway. "People are scared out there, and while I'm not saying she's a bad woman, I am saying that this is absolutely not the time for this." Thomas didn't move an inch from the doorway. He had spent the entire walk over to the house making his peace with this exact confrontation, so when the moment finally arrived, it didn't rattle him the way the sheriff probably expected it to. He told Briggs that Calloway had already tried 4 days of Western medicine and had 3 dead neighbors to show for the effort. Then he told him he was going back inside to help his wife. Briggs let him close the door, but the sound of his boots staying put on the porch told Thomas the law wasn't going anywhere. Inside the bedroom, Yuki heard every single word of the conversation. The wooden walls of the house were thin enough that she could hear the sheriff's weight shifting on the floorboards, and she could even hear 2 men in the street arguing about whether a Japanese woman was legally allowed to practice medicine in the territory. It was as if the law had ever been the thing standing between Calloway and the grave. She didn't let the noise stop her hands from moving, and she carefully adjusted a needle at the inner elbow point before checking the pulse at 3 different positions along the doctor's wrist. She was looking for the depth and the specific texture her grandfather had taught her to recognize, trying to feel if the heat was rising toward the head or moving laterally through the limbs. Once she was satisfied, she reached for the small clay pot she had placed over the lamp to keep the herbal decoction at the right temperature. Clara still hadn't moved from her spot by the window. After a few more minutes of watching, she finally crossed the room and stood at the edge of the bed so she could see exactly what Yuki was doing with the needles. "That one right there," Clara whispered as she pointed to a needle placed just below the collarbone. "What is that one supposed to do for him?" "That is the lung meridian," Yuki answered without looking up from her work. "When the body fights a heat like this, the chest begins to tighten up, and this point helps keep the breathing even so he doesn't exhaust himself." She paused for a second. "Hold the lamp a little closer to his face, please." Clara did exactly as she was asked. Around midnight, the low murmur of the crowd outside suddenly went silent, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that comes when people lose interest and go home to bed. It was the heavy silence that falls when something goes wrong and everyone watching feels the shift at the exact same time. Calloway's breathing changed in an instant, turning shallow and slow until it seemed like he had forgotten how to find his own rhythm. For 40 seconds, the air in the room felt like it was holding its breath while they waited for him to take another. Yuki moved without a hint of hesitation, drawing a needle from his inner forearm and repositioning it 2 finger widths lower before pressing her thumb hard into a point just below his right knee. She held that firm pressure for 10 long seconds until his chest finally rose with a ragged gasp. He took another breath, then another, and while the rhythm was shaky at first, it eventually settled into a pattern that held steady. Clara let out a long breath of her own, one she had clearly been holding since the breathing stopped. "That point you press below the knee," she said.
"It is called Zusanli," Yuki explained as she wiped her hands on a clean cloth. "We use it when the body's energy is collapsing inward, so you can think of it as a way to restart the system." She checked the temperature of the medicine one last time. "He needs another dose of the herbs in 20 minutes, and I need you to time it for me." Clara said she could handle that. She pulled a wooden chair right up to the bedside and sat down with the lamp still in her hand, keeping her eyes fixed on the clock hanging on the far wall. Thomas came back into the room around 1 in the morning. He didn't say a word about what had happened out on the porch or whether the sheriff was still waiting there, but he sat down in the corner and didn't leave the room again for the rest of the night. The hours between 1 and 4 in the morning carry a heavy weight when you are waiting for a body to make up its mind. Yuki had sat through long nights like this before, though not in a dusty frontier town with a restless crowd waiting outside the door. She remembered her grandfather's clinic in Osaka and the way they watched the slow argument between sickness and treatment play out in the dark. You learn quickly that you cannot rush a recovery, so you read the small signs and adjust the medicine before settling back in to wait. The decoction went in every 90 minutes, just a few spoonfuls at a time, kept warm in a small clay pot. Between those doses, Yuki moved the needles, though she only touched the ones that needed to follow where the heat was shifting in his body. The fever was not a fixed thing that stayed in one place, but rather a moving target that she had to track with her own hands. She moved with it, adjusting her strategy as the night deepened. Clara stayed right at the bedside and kept asking questions that came from a place of genuine curiosity. These were not challenges to Yuki's authority, but the kind of questions that happen when you watch something closely and your mind tries to fill in the gaps. She wanted to know what the pulse at the wrist revealed and what the bupleurum root was doing inside the decoction. Yuki answered every question plainly, just as her grandfather had once answered her, using the actual reasons instead of trying to simplify the science. Clara had a sharp mind and never needed to hear an explanation twice. Around 3 in the morning, Calloway's eyes finally opened, and it wasn't the glassy stare of someone lost in a delirium. He was actually tracking the room, looking first at the ceiling and then at the lamp before his gaze landed on Yuki sitting beside him. He watched her for a long moment without saying a word, his fingers still resting under hers as she monitored his heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and stripped down to almost nothing. "What are you doing?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for an answer. "I am monitoring your pulse because you have 3 distinct positions on each wrist that tell me how you are healing." She did not look away from her work as she explained that the middle position on his left showed excess heat that was finally starting to soften. "There is a decoction you have been taking, and while you have had 4 doses already, you will need 2 more before the sun comes up." He remained quiet for a few seconds while he processed that information. "What is in it?" he whispered. She listed the ingredients off like she was reading a ledger, naming the bupleurum, scutellaria, Pinellia, ginger, licorice root, and ginseng. After she finished the list, she briefly explained what each one was doing in the formula to help his body fight. Calloway did not interrupt her once, but instead listened with his eyes on the ceiling, like a man trying to fit an unfamiliar idea into a mental space that had not existed until that very moment. When she finished speaking, the room fell into a deep silence, while the lamp threw soft shadows across the walls. Outside, the crowd had thinned out to just 4 or 5 people who looked like dark shapes beyond the glass. Finally, Calloway looked at her and said, "Go on, then," before closing his eyes again. It was different this time, because it wasn't the collapse of a man going under, but the deliberate rest of someone who had decided to stop fighting the cure. At 4:20, the sweat finally started to break.
This was not the fever sweat that had soaked his sheets for days, but a heavier release that turned the fabric dark in wide patches as his skin let go of the heat. Clara checked his temperature with a thermometer from his own medical bag and saw it had dropped to 101. By 5 in the morning, it read 99.2, and Clara had to check it twice just to be sure she wasn't dreaming. Yuki gave him the 5th dose of the decoction at first light when he was lucid enough to hold the cup with his own hands. He drank the medicine down and kept it there, then asked for water and eventually some broth. Since there wasn't any broth ready, Clara left the room to start a fire in the kitchen, leaving Yuki and Calloway alone while the morning turned gray through the window. Yuki put her instruments back in the cloth roll and sat down in the corner chair without saying a word. She wasn't celebrating the victory, she was just exhausted, and the chair was finally empty. Calloway was back on his feet in 8 days, though he was not fully recovered and tired much faster than he used to. His assistant kept steering him away from the long house calls that required hours in the saddle, but he was upright and eating real food again. On the 9th day of his recovery, he sent a note to the ranch asking if Yuki would be willing to come by his office when she had a moment to spare. She went to see him the following afternoon. Thomas offered to ride along with her, but she told him she would rather go alone. Calloway's office smelled like carbolic soap and old paper, and she noticed immediately that he had a chair ready for her right across from his desk. He did not start the conversation with a thank you, but instead opened with a question about the 3 pulse positions she had checked at his wrist. She sat in that straight-backed chair and walked him through the diagnostic logic of pulse reading in the Kampo tradition. She explained the different depth layers and what a tight pulse meant compared to a slow one, showing him how to cross-reference those feelings with the tongue and the breath. Calloway listened the same way he read his medical journals, holding a pencil in his hand with an expression that sat somewhere between skepticism and belief. It was likely the most honest place a man in his position could land after what he had been through. He never made a grand announcement to the town, and he never admitted he had been wrong in a public speech or a letter. He simply started asking her questions. Over the following weeks, when a patient's case puzzled him, he would stop by the Hale Ranch on his way home to talk through the symptoms on the porch. He never explicitly asked for her opinion, but he would describe the case out loud to whoever was listening, waiting to see what she might say. The response from the rest of the town was much slower and more complicated than Calloway's quiet curiosity. A few people started coming to Yuki directly, though they usually arrived early in the morning or just before dark so they wouldn't be seen. In that first month, she saw a child with stomach cramps and a woman whose hands wouldn't stop shaking when she got tired. Yuki treated them all out of her kitchen and never charged a cent for the help she gave. Sheriff Briggs never said a single word to her about the night he stood at Calloway's door with his hand on his gun. One morning in late October, she passed him on the main street and he touched the brim of his hat without stopping his stride. It was a gesture that lasted about a second, but in a town like this, that second meant everything had changed. Thomas finally asked to see the inside of the medicine chest about 3 weeks after the fever had broken. She opened it on the kitchen table and went through every single compartment to explain what the herbs were and where they came from. He sat across from her for almost 2 hours and asked questions just like Clara had, looking like a man who had decided it was finally time to understand the secrets that had been living in his own house all along. The heavy chest of drawers in Calloway's office held a ledger for every soul he'd treated since 1879. And the names were all there in black and white. Roy Decker occupied a line, followed by Ada Mills and the young boy they'd pulled from the river. 3 separate entries ended exactly the same way, written in Calloway's careful, steady handwriting. Deceased. Yuki had watched those 3 people wither away long before the fever finally claimed Calloway himself. She had recognized the signs early on, noting how the joint pain arrived first, and how the delirium followed a very specific wave pattern that she had seen before. When she had been close enough to look, she saw the deep red staining the center of the tongue, and in that moment, she knew exactly what she was looking at. She didn't say a word to Calloway or Thomas or even Clara, choosing instead to grind her herbs and keep her medicine chest stocked while she waited for the inevitable. She understood, without a single person having to explain it to her, that a Japanese woman, newly arrived in a frontier town, couldn't just walk into a doctor's office and tell a Harvard-trained man he was treating the wrong illness. It wasn't a matter of being a pessimist. It was just simple arithmetic, and she had done that math during her very first week in Dust Creek and filed the answer away where she could find it. The truth finally came out on the Thursday afternoon in November, roughly 6 weeks after the fever had finally broken and left the town in peace. They were sitting together on his office porch, going over the case of a man with a persistent cough, and the conversation shifted, the way things do when two people have been circling a secret for so long that one of them finally just lets it go. "I knew what it was before you got sick," she said. And she didn't mean it as an accusation or a way to hurt him. She just put the fact down plainly between them. Calloway didn't jump to defend himself or offer an excuse, but instead he set his pencil on the railing and stared out at the main street for a long time. He was the rare kind of man who actually sat with a difficult truth rather than fighting it, and that is a quality that is much harder to find than it should be. "The 3 that died," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. He didn't ask why she had stayed quiet, because he was smart enough to understand the social walls she lived behind, and he was honest enough not to make her explain her own silence to him. He just sat there with the weight of it, feeling the cost of his own authority and the lives of the 3 people whose names were etched into his ledger. A woman's knowledge had been sitting in a kitchen just 2 miles away the entire time. But because of who she was, that knowledge had nowhere to go. Eventually, he picked his pencil back up and scribbled something in the margin of his medical notes, and Yuki didn't bother to ask what he wrote. The question that really stays with you isn't about the town of Dust Creek, but about every place that ever had someone like Yuki living in the shadows. These were people who carried real, life-saving knowledge in a language the world around them couldn't read, and they learned early on that speaking up too soon meant being dismissed before they could ever help a soul. You have to wonder how many people sat with that same calculation, and how many of them chose silence, and then had to carry the heavy cost of that choice for the rest of their lives. Yuki stayed in Dust Creek and kept her medicine chest ready for whoever might need it. She kept her silence for the most part, except for the neighbors who started showing up at her kitchen door before the sun came up, or the long talks she had with Calloway on those Thursday afternoons. The town didn't transform into a brand new place overnight, but it did start to have a little more room in it than it used to. That isn't a small thing at all, even if it isn't the kind of thing people usually write down in history books. Every morning, before the rest of the town is even awake, she sits at her kitchen table with the medicine chest open and the pestle moving in slow, rhythmic circles. The thin gray light of dawn comes through the window while she works, and even though the fever is a memory, the chest remains. A few people in town now know exactly what is inside those jars, and that is how real change happens. Not with a loud explosion, but with one door opening at a time. If this story stayed with you, hit the subscribe button. There are so many more people like Yuki whose names were left out of the history books, and we're going to keep finding them.